Hi, class. Welcome to week 7 of the course on the Trinity. This will be the last lecture for the course. I want to make sure you have plenty of time to focus on reading your Trinity text and preparing the paper, which we do at the end of next week. This week, the reading that I've assigned concerns the boundaries of how the Trinity can be used to support various doctrines. And those doctrines can be theological debates around complementarianism and egalitarianism. It could be debates about feminism. It could be debates about the secular structuring of society. It could concern the gender and sexuality debate and more. While the readings for this week are pretty focused on a few issues, the way in which they use the Trinity can be a model for us in all kinds of other areas. So I want you to pay particular attention to how they're thinking about and using Trinitarian doctrine in order to come to conclusions in the papers that you're reading this week. The question that I want to start with is the question, should theology be practicable? There's an understanding in late modern theology that was started by Immanuel Kant that says the only good theology is theology that is practicable. A practicable theology is one that leads to a certain kind of ethics or a certain way of living. So for Kant, knowing something means that you must be able to put it into practice. Otherwise, it's a meaningless thing. And so as a result, for Kant, faith has a certain compulsion with it to turn it into action. Some modern theologians, such as Jürgen Moltmann, who was working in the 20th century, Moltmann complains that this compulsion takes the form of dominating faith in order to make every piece of it meaningful for living, to make it meaningful for organizing individual life, for organizing households, for organizing society. And so in other words, faith for Kant must be a form of ethical knowledge. So what does Kant actually say about this? Here's some quotes. Kant says passages of Scripture which contain theoretical doctrines proclaimed as sacred, but going beyond the concepts of reason, even the moral ones, may be interpreted to the advantage of the latter. In other words, Kant is saying theoretical doctrines need to be run through the lens of reason and interpreted really only through reason. And those which contain statements contradictory to reason must be so interpreted, right? Contradictory things in Scripture or in faith must be interpreted in light of reason. Otherwise, they're pretty useless. He goes on a little bit later to talk about the Trinity. From the doctrine of the Trinity, taken literally, nothing whatsoever can be gained for practical purposes, even if one believed that one comprehended it, unless still if one's conscious that it surpasses all our concepts. In other words, because the Trinity is such a theoretical and abstract doctrine, it has no practical purpose whatsoever. Kant even goes on to make a lot of arguments about how it doesn't matter if there's 1 or 2 or 3 or 7 or 10 or 100 persons within the Trinity, because at a fundamental level, the Trinity is not practicable and therefore it is useless. Knowledge of it means nothing. But this is a problem because what Descartes and Kant did was turn knowledge into a new kind of thing in the modern world. Knowledge in the modern world means having power over something, being able to control and direct it, right? If we have knowledge of how to build a bridge, that means that we're controlling and directing materials to build a bridge in a certain way. If we have knowledge of ecosystems, that means that we can control them and influence them in certain ways, and I could go on. Knowledge means that we grasp something. And think about the meaning of that we're grasping it, that we're holding it in our fist, that we have control over it. We talk about this even in everyday terms. When you take a test to demonstrate your knowledge, at the end of that test, you're said to have mastery over the subject. The way in which we use our language even conveys a dominating sense that knowledge contains. When we understand something, we say, we got it, right? That says that we have some sort of control over it, that we have it in a way, in a particular kind of way. And all of these ways of talking about knowledge, they mean that we've taken it into our possession so that we can do with it what we want. And if we combine faith with this form of dominating knowledge, we end up with a faith that's fused with the desire to conquer and dominate. Now, the fathers of the church, the early church fathers, especially the Greek church fathers, they didn't think about knowledge in this way. If you think about knowing in the biblical sense, there's an intense relational consummation in which a person participates in the life of another. And for the early church fathers, knowing did not transform the object of knowledge into the property of the knower. Rather, knowing something means to participate in it. Knowledge confers fellowship with that thing. Knowing in this sense confers a sense of wonder upon the knower, as the knower now perceives the other as it really is and allows for mutual participation with each other, not domination. So when Lacuna refers to a practical trinity, she's absolutely responding to Kant here. She's arguing that we don't dominate the Trinity in order to use it and control it to make an ethical system. Rather, she's arguing that the Trinity is the way in which we know God so that we can participate with wonder in the life of God without control or domination. Late modern theologians, 20th century theologians essentially, they disagree with Kant that theology should be practicable by turning faith into reason and ethics, to turning it into a system that stands apart from the mystery of faith. Rather, modern theologians argue that theology should be practical and that it sees faith as a relational thing in which we participate in the ongoing work of the living and acting God. Now, despite the late modern theological turn to relationality, which we talked about in an earlier lecture, Kant's sense that faith must be practicable is deeply embedded into many of our church traditions, and it's hard to extract. After all, don't we all think that our faith should be paired with works? Isn't the goal of our faith to be on mission, which means acting in a certain way in the world, maintaining certain standards of behavior? And all of these things are certainly true. Christians absolutely should have a certain way of being in the world. But that way of acting for Christians shouldn't come from an ethical system that's divorced from deep relationship with the triune God. Paul addresses this in Colossians chapter 2. He says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world, rather than on Christ." In other words, he's saying, man, don't be wooed and tempted by a philosophy that exists apart from relationship with Christ. Christ comes first. And then a couple of verses later, he goes on to say, "Since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, why, as though you still belong to the world, do you submit to its rules? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch." These rules, which have to do with things that are all destined to perish with use, are based on merely human commands and teachings. Such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom, with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. Paul is calling us over and over again in chapter 2 of Colossians back into relationship with Christ. Don't be fooled by these desires to make everything practicable, to turn it into a system that can exist apart from faith, that is controlled by reason and not by relationship. This played out in the church that I grew up in. In the church I grew up in, there were several hard and fast rules. Christians don't drink. Christians don't dance. Christians don't smoke. They don't cuss. They don't play cards. And they don't hang around with people who do any of those things. I think what Paul would say to that is that these rules seem like good ideas, but they're probably based on human commands and teachings. Instead, focus on knowing and being in relationship with Christ. And it's very interesting to note, even here in this Colossians passage as well, that it almost seems like the desire for a practicable faith was around in the time of Paul, in the earliest years of the church. And so for Kant to pick this up and to talk about how important it is for faith to be practicable, it's almost like he never read Paul or never at least understood what Paul was getting at. The relationship comes first. And so this practicability tendency is really hard to shake. It's really kind of baked into how we do things in church and with faith. One of the ways in which Kant's drive toward practicability shows up is in an effort to build ethical systems out of the Trinity. As we've discussed throughout this course, Trinitarian doctrine exists at two levels, at the level of oikonomia and at the level of theologica. And throughout most of church history, the Trinity was only engaged at the abstract level of theologica. Well, in an effort to make the Trinity relevant and practicable, some people have extracted statements about God at the level of theologica and tried to apply them to human lives in an independent ethical system. Our reading for this week gives some contemporary examples of this. Some Christian thinkers have taken the idea that the Son is subordinate to the Father and developed an ethical system out of it in which people are organized into a tiered society, just like God seems to be organized into tiers. God the Father is superior to God the Son, for instance. The impulse behind such a view is that creation must in some way mirror or mimic the internal functioning of God. And one of the examples that you'll read about this week is gender relationships. One of the hot topics that have happened over the past 20 years or so is whether or not complementarian structures or egalitarian structures in which women are functionally subordinate to men or in which women are completely equal to men can be tied to the way in which the Son is either eternally subordinate to God or not subordinate to God the Father. But the ways in which the Trinity has been used to sort of support ethical systems is not constrained to egalitarian and complementarian conversations. Other constructions have been put forward as well. The theologian Lynn-Marie Tonstad has published a series of works arguing that God's internal relationships are actually queer relationships. And so both the church and the broader society should embrace queer gender theories in order to enhance our knowledge of God and to properly structure society. Some theologians use the Trinity in order to make arguments favoring feminist theology, or perhaps affirming patriarchal structures, or maybe denying feminism while also being anti-patriarchal. I've seen all kinds and read all kinds of works that do all kinds of interesting things with patriarchy and feminism. Other theologians have put forward works in which they argue that God's internal relationships should be the model for earthly government. Some argue for a strong individual leader, that we need a monarch in the same way that God is our monarch. Some argue that since relationships within the Trinity are largely equal and non-dictatorial, that government should be completely democratic, that we should insist that all governments be democratic. Some argue that since the persons of the Trinity share their resources with each other freely, that society should embrace the tenets of socialism. And I could go on and on. But what I want to emphasize is something that we've talked about almost from the beginning of this course. If we use concepts at the level of theologica to say that we know something about God, and then extrapolate that from God's internal working to the ordering of creation, then we go wrong. Everything that we know about God happens at the level of oikonomia, and so we must start there, in relationship with God. And we must continually return to the oikonomia in order to calibrate on our relationship with God. In the reading for this week, I've chosen a few authors that represent a few different viewpoints, and they've all come to similar conclusions, that we should refrain from using Trinitarian arguments to support many of the debates that we have within the church. Debates about women in ministry, debates about human sexuality and queer theory, about church governance, or even secular governmental structures. We should put a moratorium on using the Trinity to talk about or to navigate that debate. Michael Bird most especially tackles that in the article that you're assigned for this week. Now, the Trinity does function to help us understand the fundamental relationality of God and to participate in that fundamental relational reality. Turning the Trinity into a practicable structure tends to alienate relationship in favor of impersonal, ethical, or organizational structures. So if the Trinity tells us anything, it tells us that relationship and mutual participation in pursuit of unity is the way in which we share the divine image. So I hope that the reading for this week takes you one step further into understanding what the Trinity can and cannot do for us. The Trinity can definitely tell us that God is fundamentally, eternally relational and invites us to participate in that relational flow of vitality that is shared among the members and that is extended to people of faith, to everyone in creation, really. But the Trinity cannot be reduced to impersonal constructions that we use to dominate, control, or master reality in any sort of Kantian sense. It's the reality that it's so much easier for us humans to appeal to certitudes. But too often the Bible denies those certitudes in favor of faith, relationship, and wonder. All of those things are much more messy than certitudes, but it's really the only way in which we can find life. So I hope that this reading for this week is productive, and I look forward to seeing what you guys do and engaging in the forum for this week. Have a good one.